The Catholic funeral brings hope and consolation to the living. We proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and give witness to Christian hope and resurrection. We give witness to the faith of the deceased and comfort to the family, to their friends, and to the community. The body is brought to the church a final time, and the church prays for the gift of eternal life. The celebration of life offers solidarity between the living and the communion of saints. We celebrate and recall to the family and our gathered family of faith of God's mercy and the human need to turn to Him in times of crisis and sorrow. The importance of the ritual helps the bereaved accept the loss and grieve with hope. We are reminded that we are participants in resurrection. We are not just spectators. The order of Christian funerals, as practiced in the Catholic Church, has three parts. The first is the vigil service, the funeral mass itself, and then the commendation. I'll just take a minute to say, I know you're going to have questions, but we would ask that because we have so much material we would like to cover, to hold your questions off until the end, and then there will be all of us who will be here to answer them for you. The vigil service is generally held the night before, but can be also held earlier in the day of the funeral mass itself. It usually takes place at a funeral home, but can take place at the family home if desired, and occasionally it can be held in church if the funeral mass follows immediately. The vigil service consists of the liturgy of the word, which is led by a priest or a deacon, with some prayers. The rosary, if chosen by the family, is usually family-led and not led by either the priest or deacon. But this is a good time for the family to get together. It is a good time to have remembrances, to tell stories, to remember the loved one who has passed away. The importance of the vigil service is that it's a time to gather, to express our sorrow, and to receive consolation, support, and love from our friends, our neighbors, and our parish community. The second part of a Catholic funeral is the Mass of Resurrection, the funeral Mass. Generally, the funeral Mass is celebrated in the church with the body present. We gather to celebrate in faith. We celebrate our faith. We celebrate the faith of the deceased. It gives us hope, and we are surrounded by the love of family, friends, and our family of faith. When the casket arrives at the church, the casket with the body is accepted, it is sprinkled with holy water, and the pall is placed. The pall is the white garment which covers the casket. It is a remembrance of the person's baptism. When the person was baptized and joined the church, whether as an infant or later in life as an adult, they received the white garment. The name Paul comes from a Latin word pallium, which means cloak. So when we're baptized, we actually put on Christ. When our body is brought to church for the last time, the pall symbolizes that baptism and putting on Christ. It's an interesting thing, too, since we recently had a pope who was just elected. He was given the pallium, the same word that we use from Paul, from which the word Paul comes. And the pallium is a symbol of his priestly authority. It's a reminder that through baptism, we, as the laity, as members of the body of the faithful, share in the priestly ministry of the entire church. After the pall is placed, and it can be placed by the family, or it can be placed by the pallbearers or the funeral director, whatever is your choice. The Mass then proceeds with an opening procession. The family may participate in the opening procession if they choose, and most families like to do that. After the opening procession, we begin with Mass as usual. There are the readings, the homily, prayers of the faithful. The readings, the prayers of the faithful, we really ask the family and we really encourage them to participate, pick out the readings, One of the books that you picked up in the back is St. Anne's funeral planning booklet, and it has all of the appropriate readings, both from the Old Testament, from Paul's letters, and also from the Gospels. The family may also participate by being readers or have family friends as readers. In those readings, one of the things you would like to do for yourself or for someone that you are planning is try to look at those readings and see how they reflect the faith life of the deceased. In what way do they reflect who they were, how they expressed their faith? The funeral mass is all about expressing the faith of the deceased, of coming together as a community to recognize, to reaffirm the faith of us as a parish, us as a family. Following the readings, the homily, the prayers of the faithful, we continue with Mass as normal with a consecration. After communion, there is a time when the family may get up and speak. We call it remarks of remembrance. In a Catholic funeral, it is not considered a eulogy. It should be brief. It should not last long because we do not want to overshadow the liturgy of the word and the words of the celebrant. As the casket is, before the casket is taken out of the church, we have the final commendation. The final commendation takes place when the priest comes down, incense is used to incense the coffin, and prayers are said, a hymn is sung, but the incense is used as an absolution for the deceased. It acknowledges the presence of God in our midst. Its sweet-smelling perfume and high-ascending smoke enkindle the fire of God's love. It represents our prayer for the soul of the departed rising up as a pleasing offering to God. Now, there are others, after that, then the final procession takes place and the body is taken for the final commendation for burial, either at a local cemetery, or sometimes, especially at St. Anne's, sometimes the casket is flown somewhere else because not everybody lives in this area, and so we recognize that. But usually it takes place immediately following the funeral. There are some other things that can happen as a funeral. Not everyone wants a funeral mass, so they would like a funeral service. The difference between a funeral mass and a funeral service is that a funeral service is a liturgy of the word only. It does not include the consecration and communion. When it is just a funeral service, usually it is not held in church. It is usually held in a funeral home. And there is no incensing, obviously no communion. Sometimes we have what's called a memorial mass. What a memorial mass is, it's a funeral liturgy without the presence of the body. So when you hear of a memorial mass, a lot of times here at St. Anne's, when we've had a loved one who was very dear to us who dies someplace else, we can't get to the funeral, but we want to celebrate here with our family. A memorial mass is said, and basically it is a funeral mass without the body present. When the committal takes place, it is done by a priest or a deacon. The burial place is blessed, and the body is commended to the place of burial until the day of resurrection. The importance of burial, people don't understand why the importance of it, but it really helps us to understand that we need to let go, that this person that we loved through life is now gone from us. Having a place of burial gives us a place to go to remember that loved one. I know when we go back home to Philadelphia to visit family, both my parents and my husband's parents and some of my siblings are buried, we always make it a point to go to the cemetery because it's a place where we can connect with that person that we have lost. One of the things that's important to remember is that all of the funeral rites serve a purpose. Oftentimes we think, oh, we don't really need to do that. That's not important, so we can do away with that part of it. But the reality of the funeral ritual is that it really helps us to acknowledge the death, to have the hope and the faith that they are with God. And also, it helps the community to come together so that we have that support, we have that love. We are able to share in that with our fellow parishioners and our friends and family. One of the things that is always asked is about cremation. And yes, cremation is permitted by the church under circumstances. However, burial is the preferred way that Catholics should celebrate the death of a loved one. One of the things that we need to recognize, and this is from the Catholic bishops, is that the body that lies in death recalls the personal story of faith and continued spiritual presence of the deceased. That body was once washed in baptism, anointed with the oil of salvation, and fed with the bread of life. We as Catholics care for the body, and we have reverence for it, because this is the person that we loved that we now commend to the care of God. Cremation can be chosen, but the proper sequence is for the body to be present for the Mass of Resurrection and cremation following. A casket in that case is used, but it is rented, not purchased, and the lining stays with the body for the cremation. The remains are to be given the same respect that we would give the body. We need to give it the same consideration. The cremains, the ashes, should be buried or placed in a columbarium and properly memorialized. They should not be scattered. They should not be kept in a home. They should not be divided up into smaller containers. It's important to recognize the fact that when the body is cremated, we do not separate it. We treat it with the same respect that we would treat the body. One of the important things to remember is when we talk about funerals. I gave you an overview of basically what entails a Catholic funeral. One of the most important things that you can do for yourself, but especially for your loved ones, for your spouse, for your children, for your next of kin, is to really give some thought and consideration to what do you want for your funeral. We don't like to think about death. It's not one of those favorite topics that we have. We don't like to think about funerals. But you can save your family a great deal of distress by having some ideas and some planning done prior. When a person dies, it is one of the worst times for the family member to have to make a multitude of decisions at a time when they are not emotionally ready to be able to answer any questions or to make any decisions. So the more you can put effort into doing your pre-planning, the more you help your family members. First of all, it's important to understand, first, the spouse, if you are married, you and your spouse really need to come to an agreement about what you want to do. Where do you want to be buried? How do you want your remains handled? Do you want a full burial? Do you both wish to be cremated? Those are the kinds of decisions between spouses you need to make. If your spouse is gone and you're by yourself, please don't assume that your children know what you want. I can guarantee you in the many years that I have worked in pastoral care, oftentimes family members come in, children come in, and oh, mom wouldn't have cared about a Mass, and I knew mom, and mom would have been turning over in her grave to know that the family did not provide a funeral Mass. So don't assume that your children know what you want, because they may not. And they may have different religious beliefs than you do, or their practices are not what your practices are. So it's really important to sit down, take the time, think about what it is you really want and put it down on paper. Have the discussion with your family, with whoever is going to be responsible to make sure that your wishes are followed. What kind of service do you want? Do you want traditional? Do you want less formal? Do you care what kind of casket you have? Do you want the casket to be open? Do you want it to be closed? Do you know where you want to be buried? All of those things are important decisions. And unless you actually have the conversation, then your family is not going to know. And sometimes if you have older family members, before my mother died, she had a few things that she had written down, or things that she wanted, but she didn't communicate them. And she was also suffering from dementia, so it was kind of difficult to say, okay, what should we do? Now, with a big family with a lot of brothers and sisters, you knew there was going to be some confusion and, oh, Mom, we really wanted this, Mom really wanted that. No, she didn't, she wanted something else. So we sat down with Mom, and very gently, we got her to talk about what did she want for her funeral? Who did she want doing the readings? Who did she want being the pallbearers? What is it that she wanted? And gradually, over a period of time, we were able to draw from her what it is that she wanted, got her to write it. We wrote it all down, and she said, oh yeah, this is exactly what I want. Signed it. We gave it to the funeral director, and when she passed away, the funeral director came, met with the family, and everybody's gone, oh, Mom wanted this. No, I'm sorry, Mom wanted that. The funeral director picks up the piece of paper and hands it and says, it's already written down. Your mom already said what it is that she wants. So it's not a pleasant subject, but it's one that you really should have the conversation. Figure out what it is that you want to do and how you want to do it. You know, one of the things that a lot of people are concerned about in this day and age is money. You know, well, we don't need a funeral because it costs money. My parents' generation and generations before that probably would have been appalled because they looked at burying the dead as a solemn obligation. Many times they would put aside money and keep it put aside so that they would be able to provide a funeral consistent with the person who passed away. They weren't so easily, oh, let's push that aside, we don't need it. It was part of their way of honoring and recognizing the life of the deceased. There are many alternatives that we can use. Having a funeral, it can be very, very expensive, but you have to understand that there are choices that you can make. Don't let the cost be the only decision maker. The deceased deserve as respectful a burial as the family can provide. My father had an aunt who spent most of her life in a mental facility. Back then they didn't have the diagnosis, but she most likely was severely autistic based on his description of her. And when her parents passed away, her care fell to her siblings. They could not care for her, so she was put in the state institution. But the brothers and sisters put aside money for her burial because they felt it was their obligation to do it. She outlived all of them. The money passed on to the following generation, but when she passed away, they had a respectful funeral for her because they felt very much that was their obligation. And in other cultures, honoring the dead is a part of their culture. In this day and age, we tend to go, it's not important. It is. It's something we really need to think about. It's something that we need to really decide, what do we want to do and how do we want to do it? You know, there are ways of providing the funds for a funeral. You can get a policy through a funeral director. And what they do if you prepay a funeral, they have to keep that money separately in a trust. That's by state law. You could have a separate life insurance policy that would cover the costs of burial. Many of it, my parents' generation did exactly that. Or you can put money aside in a trust. That trust basically is just to take care of your funeral expenses. One of the things that is important is figuring out how to take care of it, how to pay for it. If you go the route of prepaying for your funeral, the one advantage that has is that usually a funeral director, and they're all part of larger groups, you know, that are nationwide, and if you make arrangements with the funeral director here in Georgia, but you move and you go to Florida, whoever is part of whether their dignity or whatever funeral the larger group is, they will honor those policies. It is basically an insurance policy. The one thing that it does is that you can choose a funeral, what you want, and your basic coverage, and regardless of what happens to the cost, you know, so today that funeral is $8,000. In 10 years, it's $10,000. Don't I wish it was that inexpensive? But anyway, you get what you arranged for when you paid for that insurance policy. So when you go through a funeral director to do it that way, that's the one benefit that you have. One of the other things that, you know, if you put the money aside in trust, if you buy another insurance policy, just make sure that your family knows that this is what you have and this is how you intend to pay for it. Again, it's one of those things that you can do to help alleviate the burden from your loved ones when you pass away, and to make sure that your needs and your wishes and desires will be met. One of the questions that does come up quite often is about the cemetery. Those of us who are from the Northeast or different places where there's a very heavy Catholic presence, it was almost considered sacrilege if you were buried any place other than a, quote, Catholic cemetery. And that's because the dioceses owned those cemeteries, and that's where you were expected to be buried. We really don't have a diocesan cemetery here. There are Catholic areas in some of the local cemeteries, regardless of where you are buried, be it Arlington or Greenlawn or in the National Cemetery up in Canton. The place where you are put to rest is blessed. So for us, having a Catholic cemetery is not that, you know, it's not the be-all and end-all like it was. As I said, up north, man, if you were not buried in a Catholic cemetery, somebody thought there was something wrong with you. You know what I'm talking about. You're laughing, but you know what I mean. And, you know, yes, funerals are expensive, but there are other alternatives. You don't have to have the fanciest bronze casket there is. A simple wooden casket is fine. I'll tell you a few facts that you may or may not know. In the state of Georgia, embalming is not required by law. Most funeral directors embalm, especially if the body is held over and the funeral does not take place within a day or so. The cemeteries do not necessarily require that you have to be embalmed, so that's one thing that you need to know. And there are alternative burials. We have Honey Creek Woodlands out on the grounds of the Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Conyers. You can be buried, in fact, that the only way you can be buried out there is not in a casket and not embalmed, but wrapped in a shroud and buried directly in the ground. In fact, we had a parishioner who was buried just that way not too long ago. So you do have alternatives, but you need to stop and think about what is it that you want? What matters to you? And as I said, the most important thing is to make sure that you have that conversation with your spouse or with your loved ones. For those of you who are wondering about veterans benefits, if they're not that, I mean, you don't get that much from the government if you are a veteran. If you are buried in a regular cemetery, they will provide a headstone. They will provide a flag for your casket, but the flag, everybody gets that. If you choose to be buried in the National Cemetery in Canton, that is one benefit that veterans do receive. There is no charge for the burial. The National Cemetery will open the gravesite. They will provide the vault. The vault is the large concrete box that the coffin goes in. Or if you're cremated, they have columbariums up there. And they provide that free of charge. They provide a headstone, and they will engrave the headstone. Who may be buried there with you? The veteran's spouse, and any dependent child can also be buried there. And the National Cemetery will provide perpetual care. So that is an option for veterans, but unless you died on active duty, you're not going to, they will not pay. A lot of veterans think they're going to pay for your funeral, and that is not the case. They will not. You have to keep in mind some other considerations as well. One of the things that you are going to want to do is to make sure that you get death certificates. Death certificates are really needed. You need to make sure you have enough. You've got to turn them into your insurance people for your life insurance policies. Make sure you get enough, and they usually say 10 to 15 are plenty. Make sure you have a valid will. Make sure you check with an attorney and have a valid will. One of the things you want to make sure is that when you have that conversation with your loved one, with your next of kin, or with whoever you have designated as your agent or the person who's going to follow your last wishes, you want to make sure you have all of your information in order. That means all of your financial information. Make sure you have valid wills, that they know where the bodies are buried, where are your, where do you have your accounts? What do you have? Where is it? There are a number of books that are very, very helpful. My Personal Planner is one of them. This one, Now and at the Hour of Our Death, is really good too, because this gives information about how to plan a Catholic funeral, but it also gives you information about wills, about keeping your personal information, a biography, who needs to be contacted, all of those kinds of things. Make sure you have all of that. Make sure you have durable powers of attorney as well. And you can sit down with a lawyer and talk to them, or, as I said, there are some ways you can do it. This one is a good one. This one is a little bit older, but it's called 5 Wishes. It comes from Dignity, and it tells you, this is the person I want to make my decisions, this is the kind of medical treatment I want, this is how I want people to treat me, and this is what I want to have happen to me after I pass away. So all of these things are not pleasant subjects, but they're all things that we really, really need to think about. And one more thing that I think that I would just like to, this is on a personal note, and I just want to say to you that when we are thinking about death and dying, it becomes for us a scary thing. From personal experience, I can tell you it's not scary at all. It is I personally had an incident 2 years ago where I was in heaven for a brief period of time. I almost didn't make it and almost didn't come back, but I did, through the grace of God. But the one thing that I can tell you is I worked with the dying, I worked with funerals, and it was never anything sad for me. It was always a source of great blessing. And when I almost died, I was in God's presence. And I can tell you that you have never, there was so much peace. You felt so loved. You didn't want to come back. So we think about death and we think about, oh, it's going to be awful, it's going to be horrible. No. This is why we were born. And this is what our life is all about. It's about life hereafter, life in God's presence. And to be in the presence of that kind of love and that kind of peace and that kind of joy it was wonderful to know that everything we believe is real and it's true. What we're afraid of is the unknown. We have fear of suffering. We have fear of being good enough. But let me tell you, we're good enough for God. He loves us all. Thank you.